Okay, I had a couple more things to say about biomagnification. So one is I wanted to tell you about this really famous example of biomagnification, and that's with DDT. And a lot of what we know and the reason that we changed what we do about this has to do with Rachel Carson, who wrote several really important books, but one in particular is called Silent Spring. And it's called Silent Spring because the idea was if we don't do something about a lot of the chemicals that we were using, um, the birds weren't going to sing anymore, and we weren't going to hear their songs in the spring. And so this was an iconic kind of book that changed what we do, and it was talked about in Congress when they were trying to decide what to do. So basically, what happened is this DDT, it biomagnified, and so a lot of birds of prey were affected the most. So things like peregrine falcons and bald eagles. And I think one of the reasons that we acted to ban DDT back in 1972 was because it was harming bald eagles. And, they're our national symbol. And so nobody wanted to lose bald eagles as kind of the symbol of the United States. So basically, what happens is DDT. It biomagnifies up the food chain, like we were talking about before. Bald eagles and peregrine falcons eat a lot of fish, and they would have these really high levels of DDT in their tissues, and it made their bodies not be able to form eggs properly. And so the eggs they would lay had shells that were very, very thin. And they found that this was because DDT. If you had bald eagles and peregrine falcons that did not have lots of DDT in their tissues, they would make normal eggs. And so what happened is they would sit on their eggs to keep them warm, like we know many birds do, and the eggs would break. And so they their reproductive potential declined dramatically because many of the birds were sitting on their eggs and they were breaking, and so they couldn't raise chicks because there weren't any chicks after they broke the eggs. And so we saw dramatic declines in a lot of birds of prey, but particularly peregrine falcons and bald eagles. And so this map shows the breeding range of peregrine falcons, which are the dark colors, and it shows the estimated numbers of nesting pairs of peregrine falcons through time. And so you can see this is in thousands. So there were almost 4,000 nesting pairs of peregrine falcons in 1900. And by the 1960s, it was a quarter, and it got even lower almost in 1980. And that was part of the reason that that Congress chose to ban DDT. And since then, a lot of our bird populations have recovered quite a bit. Peregrine falcon numbers are up, bald eagle numbers are up, along with some other birds as well. And this is mostly because we did a lot of other conservation efforts, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that we banned DDT that was so harmful to so many different kinds of wildlife, but particularly to peregrine falcons and bald eagles. And a lot of it has to do with the work of Rachel Carson. So we can be pretty thankful. It's a conservation success story, banning DDT. I did want to point out it is still used in some places. There is still some DDT out circulating, but it is not allowed in the United States. I want to talk about one effect that contaminants can have is called endocrine disruption. And endocrine system is your system that deals with hormones. So sometimes you will get some contaminants or man-made chemicals that will mimic normal hormones. And basically what happens is it means that these other chemicals will bind to hormone receptors in our cells, and our body thinks that they are a hormone that it's made, whereas it's not. And so you can see that this can change what your body is going to do. And the reason this is particularly harmful is because hormones work at really small concentrations. You don't need a lot of a hormone in your blood to create some kind of biochemical response. And so, because these contaminants can mimic our hormones, or some of them do, you don't need a high concentration that would be harmful in other ways for it to start things or change things with your endocrine system. And so these usually occurs with chemicals that are similar structure to hormones. An example are environmental estrogens, and so these are contaminants or man-made chemicals that have a similar structure to estrogen. And it can cause reproductive problems at very low doses. Often in males, it can be feminizing, so we get organisms that will develop unusual, unnatural kinds of reproductive structures because of that. A lot of this work has been done in amphibians, but they found it in alligators and mammals and even people. And so some of these chemicals, you can see here, BPA, one of the reasons that if you've ever been in the kids section or if you've looked at your water bottle and it says BPA free, it's because BPA is an estrogen mimic. There are other plastic compounds that they think might be just as bad. And so just because it's BPA free doesn't mean it doesn't have any endocrine disruptors in that plastic. But the main problem with endocrine disruptors is that they can cause changes in your body at very small concentrations. All right, the next type of pollution I want to talk about is excess nutrients. And basically, plants and other organisms that do photosynthesis need nutrients to be able to do photosynthesis. The two largest nutrients affecting ecosystems are nitrogen and phosphorus. And so when we get too much nitrogen and phosphorus in different ecosystems, things change. Now, obviously, we add nitrogen and phosphorus to agricultural fields to boost production to get more plant growth, but when that gets into our water, it can cause a lot of problems. In general, nitrogen and phosphorus are scarce in water, so when we add them, when it runs off of agricultural fields, or we also get a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in wastewater, when they treat sewage and things like that, there's a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in that, and that can cause problems when it's put into water. So it basically fertilizes all the aquatic photosynthesizers. A lot of time that means algae. So we get high growth of algae. Eventually that algae dies. As the algae decomposes, the bacteria decomposing the algae takes up lots of oxygen, and it can take almost all of the oxygen or even all of the oxygen out of the water, which can cause everything else living in that water to die. So it's a complicated set of steps that I'll go through here, and it's called eutrophication. So eutrophication, adding too much nutrients to water, usually from fertilizer or from wastewater. There have also been some problems with having phosphorus in our detergents, and so that ends up in wastewater. That nitrogen and phosphorus increases the growth of plants in water, particularly algae. It reduces the amount of light that can make it through the water. Eventually, those algae die off. They decompose. The bacteria are the ones decomposing them usually. And the bacteria will use up all the oxygen in the water, and it can cause other organisms to die, including fish. So we get these fish kills. It's not always this extreme, but if you see water that's bright green, usually that's a lot of algae, and you can guess that there's probably eutrophication occurring. So this just goes through those steps. So increase in nutrients, fertilizing algae, Algae shade bottom-dwelling plants. Plants and algae die. Decomposition from bacteria uses up oxygen. Animals die, making a fish kill. Sometimes we'll get a dead zone, and that's a large area where there's very low oxygen and where lots of the animals are dying. So this shows a eutrophic lake here. You can see all this mats of green stuff on the surface is just algae growing like crazy. This is an example of a fish kill, so this might not look like fish, but each one of these kind of oval shapes is a dead fish floating on the surface of that water. So the oxygen in this water is probably extremely low, and the fish, if they can't gulp air, some fish can gulp air, and some fish can't. Same thing for some other aquatic organisms. Some aquatic organisms can breathe or get oxygen from both the water and the air. Some cannot. But if you pull all the oxygen that's dissolved in the water out, decomposing these dead algae, then the animals that can't breathe air are going to die. So a dead zone is just an extreme version of this. And we have our very own dead zone at the end of the Mississippi River, where it has very, very low oxygen, which we call hypoxia, or if there's no oxygen, it's called anoxia. And this often occurs in the deep waters, just where the Mississippi River spits out. And all these light green areas on this map, so in case sometimes this is hard to see. So this is the Gulf Coast, this is Florida, and so this is the Mississippi River Basin, and the river goes up this way. But the light green areas are farms. Often, most of them are putting fertilizers, and the reds are cities that have wastewater with lots of nutrients. And so all the runoff from this area comes into the Mississippi River and ends up right here in the Gulf, and that causes a dead zone. And so this is the 2014 dead zone, and you can see the dark red is the lowest oxygen levels. So basically this is Louisiana's problem, because of what all the farms in the Midwest are putting on their fields primarily. And so we have large areas. It's really damaging for our fishing and seafood industries. This shows another picture of the dead zone, and this looks at the changes in the area of hypoxia, or very low oxygen. And you can see the goal line is here to have the dead zone be quite small. And recently it's actually been worse, and so we're not actually getting towards our goal very well. Now, we don't have the only marine dead zone. They are all over the world, and these red dots show a number of different dead zones, and this shows the increase in frequency of dead zones through time. So it kind of looks like an exponential curve, like we talked about with human population growth. So we're having more and more dead zones through time. So a couple of different sources of nitrogen and phosphorus. This shows a lot of them. I mentioned them before. So discharge of untreated municipal waste is bad, but also treated municipal waste often has nitrates and phosphates in it. Concentrated animal operations, so like chicken houses, very concentrated pig farms, and cattle lots have lots of nutrients that can end up in the water. Detergents I mentioned, some of them have phosphates in them. They've banned them, I believe, in dishwashing detergent, but I don't think they've been banned in clothes washing detergents. So you can look for phosphate-free soaps when you're buying soap if you want to decrease some of these problems. And then there's also industrial addition of nitrogen during combustion.